All right. Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to the Holy Ruckus Podcast, episode 62, part 2. Let's talk about racism. Let's talk about things that divide us. And we're going to try to do it with love in our hearts, but also with some resolve and some boldness. And you can't say boldness without Father Pat Mullen. What's up, Father?
Hello, good people. Yes, I'm like the flaming Takis of I am boldly sporting something that no matter what comes of you're listening in to our conversation today, we can all agree that the World Series champions are phenomenal and we're all Nats fans, I hope, or I'm going to convert Josh eventually one of these days.
Yeah. You're going to have to do a big job because I don't even like baseball. But anyway, here we go. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for being with us. Let's meet our panel of beautiful people. Let's start with, someone that led us yesterday, 2 days ago. Miss Ogechi, go ahead and introduce yourself to the folks.
Hi, my name is Ogechi Calaberry. I am one of the content creators for the Holy Ruckus. I live in Maryland, and I'm excited for the second part of this conversation.
All right, and our next lady, go on ahead.
Hi, my name is Dominique Seraphin. I live in Maryland now for 7 years, originally from New York City.
There you go. Always claiming New York. I don't know, girl. You've been in Maryland an awful long time.
You gotta represent. Always in New York. Sorry.
BG, go ahead, Mr. BG.
All right. My name is Brian Greenfield. I'm a teacher and a speaker. I live right outside Tampa, Florida. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C.
There you go. Everybody knows Father Pat, so I'm going to go ahead and swipe the other way, Father Pat. Let's go with Mr. Professor Tenney.
Not professor. My name is Mike Tenney. I'm a high school theology teacher at St. Vincent Pallotti, Catholic high school in Laurel, Maryland. I'm also a Catholic speaker and musician, and I write for the Holy Ruckus blog.
Awesome. And so, yes, and he does so many awesome things, Mr. Mike Tenney. Thanks so much for being here. Everyone, ladies and gentlemen, go ahead and drop us some love and say hello on the comment section. We have someone monitoring those. Don't be a troll. Otherwise, I'll show you the door. But otherwise, we love you, and we're so happy to have you listening and watching at whatever time, whatever you're wearing. Folks, can we be honest with ourselves? Are we wearing pants today? Are we rocking pants in quarantine? Are we rocking pants or a skirt? What are we doing?
Gym shorts.
I plead the fifth.
Awesome, guys. Well, thanks so much. We all know Father Pat's wearing a kilt, and we'll go there. All right. But in all seriousness, let's bring it on. Father Pat, do you want to lead us in our scripture for this evening?
For those who are playing the home edition, we're praying with the Gospel according to Luke chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. On a Sabbath, he went to dine at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and the people there were observing him carefully. In front of him, there was a man suffering from dropsy. Jesus spoke to the scholars of the law and Pharisees in reply, asking, "Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath or not?" But they kept silent. So he took the man, and after he had healed him, dismissed him. Then he said to them, "Who among you, if your son or ox falls into a cistern, would not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day?" But they were unable to answer his question. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. So, as I hear this, as I have read it throughout the last couple of days, this is actually the architect of this night is a friend of mine, and so Tony put this together, and so he couldn't be with us today. So, with love, I'm just gonna try to do my best to do this in his stead. But one of the reflection points that he made that really resonated with me, I'd like to share with you on that scripture and why we chose it, why we start each conversation with the word, right? So that we can act like him and act in him indeed, right? In action. Jesus recognizes the dignity of the person above the application of the law, or the legalistic approach, right? He challenges the system in place, or the way of doing things. You can't do this on the Sabbath, right? He disobeys in that sense, right? Because he is the Lord of the Sabbath. We know this, right? He is the lawmaker, the lawgiver, right? So he can move and pivot any way he wants to, right? But he challenges the system in place and the way of doing things, the routine and the comfort level of folks that live probably legalistically, right? And so he speaks truth to power in a space where he has some clout, being as he is a Jewish man, right? And so as we read this, the example of Jesus and how he stands up for the dignity of persons, or even I was watching or on Facebook looking at the mini feed, and I saw the picture of the 99, right, where Jesus goes after the one, and the 99 are off to the side, and someone like brought it back up in a little meme or a little political cartoon, right? How Jesus is going after. And I think that's what we're called to do now. Do we understand that? What is the priority here, right? You know, even in our country, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but like what sits at the top of our church's teachings as we engage the culture and we try to bring our faith and we try to bring our Jesus, right? And we share one faith in the Lord. Are we recognizing the universal dignity of every human life, of the person and the need at the moment, at the present moment, and willing to put that uphold that firstly? Are we willing to personally act and be in, I dare say, like in a persona Christi, right? Because we have something to offer the world, that we can bring Christ into these situations to defend the dignity of the person, much like Christ models for us, and bring healing, even when it goes against a system in place, which is our topic for the day, which is talking about systemic racism, the structures of racism that we may see, and it might be obvious to us, but even in the things that we don't see and that we're even complicit of. Like Jesus, the question for us is, do we exercise our influence and even our privilege or our place to challenge these systems and to talk about it and to stop the cycle of sin and the assault on the dignity of the person? Obviously, there's no elephant in the room. We're talking about the fact that we have an all-out assault going on against our brothers and sisters who are in the image and likeness of God, right? The Black community in this case, right? What are we willing to do to be Christ in the world, right? And so we're gonna jump right in, right, to our first question, talking about systemic racism. And honestly, I had to go back and forth trying to find definitions and because I thought you think you know, but you have no idea. This is wait, where was that from? Is it the real world? I don't know. But anyway, I thought I knew. But anyway, I wanted to ask Ogechi, since she led this already 2 days ago. Ogechi, a definition for systemic racism that could definitely like help us kind of start off. Go ahead.
So there's actually 3 types of racism. There's the interpersonal, so the relationship between people on an individual level, institutional racism, and then structural racism. And so I think what we're talking about when we say systemic is the combination of that interpersonal and institutional racism within our society that creates that structural racism. And they overlap often, but structural racism amplifies the treatment that we might receive on an interpersonal or even institutional level. And so there's a whole system that is fed by biases, stereotypes, and harassment that are based off of thinking about people of a different race, in this case, a Black person of a different race, in a negative light. And your actions and then the policies and structures behind that are affected by those negative stereotypes and biases.
And that was incredibly holistic, right? But this idea of racism, and it's stuff that we can see and something that we can pinpoint, some things that we can see as tangible. But I don't know, I wanted to share a little bit more with Mike Tenney. What did you believe prior to this moment? What is systemic racism?
So Ogechi, first of all, last time on the first panel, you did like such a fantastic job and like
Thanks.
of just facilitating and just helping people understand. And there was a couple like questions that I've always had that you answered, and I was like, wow, that makes so much more sense. So I'm glad you're here. So thank you for that. And what you said was like very much similar to what I was going to say, is that when we use the word racism, a lot of times we talk past each other because we're using the same word to mean like 3 or 4 different things. And there's that individual like one-to-one racism, but then there's the larger things. And we have a similar language for that in the church. We have personal sin, and then you have social sin. You have larger structures of sin. And John Paul II, in his great encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, he talked about a culture of life and a culture of death. And the culture of death are those things which make it hard for people to do the right thing. So like if I am a college girl and I get pregnant and I don't have options on campus for daycare, it's harder for me not to choose abortion. That's part of the culture of death. Okay, if I live in a place where assisted suicide is the law of the land, and all of a sudden now there's not, after years of this going on, now there aren't places for people who have terminal illnesses to get hospice, because that has become the exception rather than the rule. The rule has become assisted suicide and euthanasia. It's harder for someone in that culture to choose to live with a terminal illness rather than go with euthanasia. And I feel like that's what we're talking about with the culture of death. And when it talks about racism, there's so many ways in our culture where it has become difficult to do the right thing. It becomes difficult to not fall into stereotypes. And so there's one more type that you talked about, individual, and then or interpersonal, you talked about institutional and structural. There's one more that I think the church would talk about, and that's kind of the phrase I use is philosophical racism. So like think of the Nazis, think of the white supremacists, people who, if you ask them, are white people superior to black people, would say yes. And the word the church has for that is heresy. It's a false teaching. Because it denies the fundamental teaching of what God has told us, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, children of Him, and we're all united in that dignity. So I very much agree with you, and I think it squares very nicely with what we've talked about with the language the church has to talk about racism.
And the church would say what about the structures of racism? That they would just liken it to that social sin, or what would they say exactly?
Yeah, so they would say it's a social sin and it's part of the culture of death. Yeah. And John Paul II like specifically said in some of his talks that racism is a life issue. So if you are pro-life, you should be anti-racist as well, under the umbrella of being pro-life.
Right. You follow up with that, Father Pat? What are you thinking? Stroking your beard? What do you got?
My beard is in self-stroke mode. That don't think that out. That's weird. So yeah, I snaps to our first 2 responses. I mean, the structures of sin. We should think in terms of like, while personal sin is like the first thing that I examine my conscience when I'm approaching confession. Structures of sin broadens the conversation, and like it's certainly possible to do a personal examination of conscience of how do I participate in like the social sin, but you also have to consider your vocation as a response to that healing and reform. So the vocations that are in the church, those who are called to be in the world but not of the world, we're all called to be part of that healing ministry. I guess there was one conversation that I had after Tuesday that really made me wish that this had come up or had somehow organically flowed out of it. So I'm just going to drop it in here and let people take it with them as they go or as they will. But we know that hurt people, and that's been true for a good long while. But because of who we are as Christians, we also believe that healed people heal people. And that is equally, if not even more powerfully true. And I think that's something that even individuals are called to do to address structures of sin. Because it's very easy in a conservative mindset to say, I'm only interested in my personal responsibility. I'm only interested in my tongue. And if I don't use racial epithets, then why should I bother about institutional racism? Well, because we all participate in this interconnectedness.
We're all connected. There's a communion. Thank you, Father. There's a communion that we all share, right? We're all in this together. Well, it sounds good, looks good on a bumper sticker, right? You see those coexist, right? It looks good, but then when you start looking at it, and yes, there is a little inventory, a personal inventory that I have to do, introspection, like looking at myself and examining my conscience. We talked about that 2 days ago, which was fantastic, and gone to confession since then. But then what other structures are already in place that I may not be seeing? And so when I was taking on this role of kind of looking into it, and doing some reading and having links sent over to me and opening my horizons and seeing just how ignorant I can be, right? Things I didn't even think about. The fact that even in our church, that we weren't allowing blacks to enter into seminary in the late 1800s, and the ramifications of that, or black women being held without like going to go become nuns, right? This is all things that are systemic. I'm a big sports fan, and I think about things that were in place in the NCAA with profiteering and marketing and jerseys and shoes and video games off of their athletes, predominantly in basketball and football, like the black athlete, and they don't get a cent for all that. I think about the housing and the educational opportunities, these systems that stack against this community, and that's what I'm opening myself up to. So this brings me to my next one, like examples of like this structure, right, in our history, in American history. We'll get to in our church, right? But like, what are some things that, like, now that you've sat with this for a little bit, you've had these questions, what are some examples of racist structures that you've seen? I want to pivot this to Dom. What's up, Dom? Go things that you've seen.
Well, I guess, being from New York, New York, everybody says New York is like the melting pot, and it really isn't. It's silos. New York, you have your Italian neighborhoods, your Greek neighborhoods, your Korean neighborhoods, and everybody kind of knows each other's culture a little bit, but people become very prejudiced. And so growing up in New York, there were times when I'd be driving in a neighborhood and, in a predominantly white neighborhood, and I was pulled over for no reason because I was in a white neighborhood. And even simply things walking into a store with my girlfriends who were also African American, and being followed around. And it's just it's a disease that there's prejudice, which is like a preconceived idea, and then there's racism, which is prejudice manifested. And so I just feel like whether it's in, and I was talking to Josh about this earlier, that this is something, my parents were born and raised in Haiti, a Caribbean nation in the Caribbean, a little country, French-speaking country. And, I said, even within the Black community, the Caribbean community, there's racism. And it's implicit, and you see it everywhere. I know that we can speak about it, Ogechi, I'm sure you could add to this, but I've grown up, there's the whole light skin, dark skin thing. There's the whole, not being proud of who you are, having your hair a certain way and being called a certain thing by my parents or others. It's just, it's a very complex situation. And it presents itself not only whites and blacks, it presents itself within different subcultures. And this is something that I think we need to sit down and talk about. I've had so many people reach out to me in the last couple of days and say, how can we solve this? And I said, we can't solve it. We need to understand it. And I think that's the big problem, is that people are being very reactionary, but they're not understanding the depth of this, the systemic racism, how far back this goes, and how our country was founded on this. And so I just think that we need to do a better job just bringing people together and sitting down and really understanding the root of this. And Ogechi, on Tuesday when you spoke, a few things you said, I love them. One of the things was that it's going to take courage and humility to have these conversations. And I was like, when you said that, I was like, amen, sister. We need to have courage and humility. And, you know, are people ready to do that? And when I say courage and humility, I mean all African Americans, Latinos, Asians, everybody needs to sit and have these conversations. So.
Ogechi, I see you snapping and the wheels are turning. Ogechi, and then I'm going to go Brian. Thanks so much, Dom. Thank you.
Okay. I do have to correct again about the definition of
Go
racism.
for it. Mm-hmm.
I am a stickler. So when you were talking about racism, especially as it relates to the Black community, I think what you meant to say was prejudice. And so we do have a lot of prejudice within the Black community. And you were talking about light versus dark, that colorism that exists, and that you're taught that the more Eurocentric you look and appear, the more value, the better the more attractive you are, and people, and this is a whole nother conversation, but that plays a dynamic in feeling worthy. And if you look more Eurocentric, then you have this bias and prejudice against people that look less Eurocentric or darker skin or more African. And that's because of the biases that we internalize, that whether it's in media or from prejudice or racism that we receive as a Black community. In terms of the more structural or systemic way that I've seen racism, whether it's personally or how I've learned it, is something as simple as the educational system. Education is supposed to be the great equalizer, but if statistically, even if a student starts from the same background, socioeconomic background, great neighborhood, same school, on a statistical level, a Black male student is less likely to be advanced and more likely to be punished for the same behavior that their white student counterparts are. And that is based off the bias. Well, the teacher is supposed to teach, and if you have these unconscious biases that you carry with you in your profession, whether it's in teaching, there's a disproportionate rate of mortality amongst Black women. So for me, as someone that would love to have children, my biggest fear of ever becoming a mom is that I might not make it to become a mom. The death, whether you're rich or poor, amongst Black women after they give birth is far higher than any other demographic. And so that systemic system that comes with biases, lack of listening to those Black patients, all of those biases that we might brush off as that like uncle that's rude or they're not necessarily politically correct, that has a consequence that affects the future, whether it's education of that person and their likelihood to go to college and get a great income. That affects the livelihood and literally the lives of different people when it comes to me, like being a mom and worrying about going to a hospital and not being able to be respected or heard by my medical professional.
BG, Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, like, so this has been a flood of information, like, since the beginning of this. I've just been sitting back, just like kind of like trying to collect my thoughts. There's a couple of things that were said. You said in the beginning that everything that's going on is like, we need to, it attacks the dignity of Black Americans, African Americans. It attacks the dignity of everybody. You know what I mean? It attacks everybody's dignity because it lowers everybody, but just in different ways. You know what I mean? You just think about it like this. If you go to a sports game and you see someone being crass, even if it's towards the team that you dislike, you understand that this person is lowering who he is. This person is going to a base level and you look down at that person. Racism, whether you're a Black person that's experiencing it or whether you're a person that's not a minority and that's dishing it out, is lowering everybody. You know what I mean? So when we have these discussions and we fight this racism, we understand this. We're collectively fighting for the humanity of everybody. You know, we're trying to raise everybody in this. When it comes to the church, and the thing is, like, the separation that we see in the culture and the unity that we see in the church, that's basic. That's Christianity 101. like following Christ. Now, the difficulty that I've seen that kind of sparks racism is some people have the tendency to want to fit Jesus into their isms, right? We have a standard of how I want to live, and let me just fit Christ in here to validate what I already want to do, So I want to go down this path anyway, so let me make it so that this is the path that Christ will go down, so that I can convince everyone else to follow me down this path. So we've kind of flipped it, and we say that we worship Christ, but in reality, we worship a God, but that God looks a lot like us, right? So what we need to do is, in my mind, and what this whole thing has sparked in me, and it's been going on for a while, is just like a conversion experience where Christ is the standard. I'm not going to fit Christ into the box of what I already, I'm not going to say Christ is going to measure up to the lifestyle that I want to live. I know that Christ is the standard. So I'm going to live according to that standard, And that is in stark contrast to the lifestyles of some people that even claim to be Catholic or Christian, I want to live the way that Christ calls me to live, not fit Christ into the box that I've created about what life should look like, all right? That's if we go there, that eliminates all of this division. That eliminates all of this racism, classism, all of that if we live in imitation of Christ. What I've seen, and I don't mean, and I'm just, this is what happens when you leave me bottled up on mute for like the last 15 minutes. I kind of rev up, and it's like shaking a can of soda and then trying to open it up, and you expect something to easily come out, and then it just explodes on you. But so I don't want to apologize because this is your fault because you left me. But the church and what the church is called to be, 4 marks of the church: 1, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. The church is what society is saying that they want to see. They just don't know it yet. What do we hear? Peaceful protests. What do we hear? We want everyone to be respected. What do we hear? We want unity. What do we hear? We want to stand together. In essence, that is what the church is. That's the foundation of the church. So we are what the culture is striving to be, but the culture has no idea that the answer is already presented to you. Just look in this direction. They're trying to kind of reinvent the wheel, and there's chaos ensuing in the process. But when we talk about like racism and I think we've all experienced it in different ways. Whether someone has said something to me, or truth be told, whether we've dished it out ourselves, because I don't think in the culture that we live in, any of us are unscathed or innocent. We've either said something or we've sat through people saying things. This is a moment of conversion. This is a moment where, listen, I don't want to monopolize anything, but let me. And then I'm going to be quiet. I promise you. What we saw with George Floyd, I don't want to skip into this. What we saw with George Floyd is, it's like this. You can't feed the culture a consistent diet of death and getting God out of the way. You can't have this consistent diet of life is just the sum of what you can give to me. Life is worthless. There's nothing valued of life in and of itself. You can't give people value, like say that like violence is valued or life is meaningless. You can't feed people a consistent diet of that. And then when someone acts from the diet that you've been feeding them, you can't really be surprised at that, because you've shown these people this is what we do. This is what life is about. What we have right now is an opportunity. Everybody, and I'm just talking the church and secular culture, and I'm not saying everyone in the church, because not everyone is. Some people see it totally clearly right now. Some people knew this from the beginning, but a lot of people, it's like a mirror is put in front of you. This is what can end up happening if you keep giving this message and pushing Christ out of your lives. This is what can happen. This is a moment. I just think it's a moment for conversion, where we have like a wake-up call. And what's unique about this wake-up call is that we can't run from it. We can't like get something to take our minds off of it. It's right in front of us. This is a moment
Absolutely.
where we have
And it was funny.
I'm going to stop talking.
No, Brian, thank you. I'm going to pivot back to you actually in a minute. But honestly, like this was something that I saw in a meme. It was a 2020 meme. How everybody was, I don't know if anybody saw it. It was like, everybody's dreading 2020. Everybody hates 2020. But no, like 2020 was a roll call, was a call to wake up for a second and check your biases at the door, to look at the things that are uncomfortable and to sit in it for a minute, and then to move, and to be prudent, right? A lot of times, even myself, I've been victims of just firing off. And I'm like, wait a second, why am I trying to solve it, guy with like a savior complex for a second? Like, I got to understand it. And so in that, I'm trying to understand. What helps me is hearing it off of experiences. So are there any experiences that you guys have faced of the structures of racism, either like at the university you went to, at the school you went to, at the job you did, even in the church? Let's open that door. I think all of us have worked for the church or have done ministry in the church at some point. We don't have to name names, but like, I don't know, are there examples of this structure, this systemic racism that we're seeing? Like, we're talking about it, but like, let's, you don't want to spend too much time on this evil. But at the same time, we gotta understand it. Ogechi, what are you thinking? See how you're unmuted.
So I think just because people like to say that they're people of faith and the Catholic Church calls for this and that, but we also like learn that if we don't know our history, we can't really be of good use in changing our present and our future. And so when I look at my identity as a Black Catholic, it's twofold. So I'm African American, and when I call myself African American, it's because I'm Nigerian and I'm American. And those two identities play a large part in my expression of faith. There's the beautiful history of music and dress and cultural celebration that comes with my Nigerian heritage. But there's also that dark history of that European colonization that took part in many parts of Africa, and many of the people that helped fund that colonization was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church took part in that expansion, and the result is that the Catholic faith is in so many different and diverse countries. But with that also came the destruction of a lot of cultural practices and capitalism that led to many abuses of people. My first instance of feeling not ashamed, but kind of like, this is an interesting dynamic of being a Black Catholic, was when I took an Africana Studies class, and I read diaries of slaves and slave owners, and I was learning how they were using the Bible to justify, kind of like what Brian is saying, using Jesus and fitting it in their box. So there was a system of slavery that was very lucrative, taking people from their homes in Africa, bringing them to the Americas and the Caribbean and South America, creating this structure that made a lot of people a lot of money. And they needed to justify that morally, so they fit their faith into that structure. Now, later on, the Catholic Church was useful in helping to abolish slavery in some places, but there was still that history that existed. And so I had to people look at me like, how could you still be Catholic knowing this? How could you still be Christian knowing this? And I recognized that they use their faith to justify evil, but that is not the purpose of the faith. That's not what we're called to do. And so my belief is separate from their misuse of the gospel and God's teachings and things like that. And so sometimes when I'm thinking about racist structures, I think of the ways that the Catholic Church might have been complicit. They had segregated churches. Josh talked about priests not being able to enter seminaries. That's a way of, maybe personally in their conversations, they would be kind to Black people. But if you're complicit to the structural systems and policies that are a result of racism and biases, then it kind of is like, are you following the law because it's the law, or are you choosing to follow your faith? And there are some ways that the church, in following the law that was unjust and racist, almost just by their silence or by their inaction was complicit to racism.
Wow. Father Pat, what do you think, man? Examples for you that you've seen?
Yeah, I guess I would kind of harken back to the idea of social sin that Mike introduced us to and kind of walked us through alongside of Ogechi's treatment of the idea of structures of sin. So even something as simple as an element of our faith that is truthful, that we do believe and we do try and follow, and none of us is exempt from, like the idea of suffering, the reality of suffering, and the fact that every single one of us, as the Lord has told us, has a cross that we need to willingly take up in order to be his disciple, to follow after him. But there have been at times, even within the church, let's say an overemphasis or kind of an intellectual suppression of ideas on the basis of, well, you have to suffer, like, so suffer, right? Like, embrace the cross that is yours, know your place, stay in your lane, know your role, and call that the suffering that you must bear, and that is your lot in life. So this is something that has been used for, the oppression of people across the socioeconomic spectrum, but it's definitely an example of something that we believe being twisted a little bit. The same way that we would, look at the misreading of St. Paul's letter to Philemon, that, we're not going to pause and, do a Bible study, but we could, and certainly it does come up in the lectionary for a reason, because there are plenty of places in Scripture that we have used to gloss over these realities and say, like, you see, like, really that they don't exist. Like, why are you making waves? Like, really what all that matters is that we're Christians.
Oh no.
Are Christians. So what's the big deal, right? And those are ways that the church has unknowingly, or the believers of the church, because we do want to make that distinction between, like, the church, the bride of Christ, the body of Christ in her sanctity and her inviolability, and those who have shepherded her and those who have followed within her, who have participated in the propagation and perpetuation of evils.
Thank you, Father. Go ahead, Mike.
All right, if you hear a little holy ruckus here, it's because my son JP is chilling with me. He's right there. So anyway, if you hear a little bit, that's what's going on. I love this conversation, and I feel like I could sit down with each one of you and just talk about some of the things that you brought up, Brian, Pat. You just brought up a lot of really good things. So in terms of, like, examples of racism, obviously as a white man, these are not things that, like, I experience directly, but things that I've seen, and then things that I've just, like, studied in my studies. So over the past 15 years of teaching, my school was always a pretty diverse school, but maybe in the last 6 or 7 years has become a majority African American. So a lot of my experiences is from watching my students and hear them talk about the same things that Dom just talked about walking into a store and all of a sudden the store owner's watching you. Like, why are you watching me? Or, I take my students on retreat, and, then, like, the groundskeeper of the retreat center comes, like, barges into our free time and like gives all the guys a talk about being, like, what it means to be a man of responsibility, because he found stuff on the floor. And it's like, you didn't do that when I was bringing white kids on a retreat, like, and they were messy, and so, like, I see little things like that, and even trying to recognize implicit bias within myself. I have a student in class who I'd never had before, and I just seen them in the hallways, and they get to my class, and I'm like, wow, they're a really great student. And I think, like, why didn't I think they would be a great student? Like, did I see them in the hallway? Did I see them goofing around? Would I've had that same thought about them if they were a white student? Like, when I see two white boys in the hallway, like, messing with each other, does that have the same impact on me when I see two black boys in the hallway, like, messing with each other and pushing each other around? Like, do I think one is just, like, roughhousing, and do I think the other one is, Like, and so I've had to do a lot of examination of myself and just like think about like, do I have these biases? Where do I have these biases? And then like hearing on 2 separate occasions, I've been talking to people I know about where they're going to send their kids to high school. And I say, well, have you thought about Pilates? And on 2 separate occasions, I've had people say, I'm not sending my daughter to school with all those black kids. Happened twice. And it's just like, I don't know what to say to that, you know, and I've thought about it, and like, it's one of those situations where like a week later, you're like, yes, this is the perfect thing, and this is what I should have said. But in the moment, you're just like shocked. It's like, I can't believe I'm hearing this in the 21st century. So I've seen little things like that. And Dom and Ogechi were talking about how even with, Ogechi, I think you call it colorism, like even within the Black community, like certain like physical attributes that are closer to like white attributes are considered more, you know, more beautiful. And I hear the girls in my school talk about, oh, well, she's light-skinned. Oh, well, she's this. And the light-skinned girls are considered the pretty ones. And the darker skinned girls are not considered the pretty ones. And I had a student earlier this year, excuse me, buddy. I had a student earlier this year, she, an African-American 12th grader, she wrote a paper on, it was just like a self-reflection paper. One thing she talked about is a song by Beyonce called Brown Skin. And she just talked about how meaningful it was for her to see in a piece of media, like brown skin, like seen as beautiful. And she talked about how, you know, watching Disney movies and stuff growing up, it's mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And it never occurred to me before that in our language, literally to be fair means to be beautiful. And so I've seen things like that, and on a personal level from my students, but then also, you know, I've read about discrimination in housing, the practice of redlining. If you don't know what that is, Google it. And even like talking to a friend of mine who's a realtor and saying like, you know, lots of times I don't even show white families the Black neighborhoods. And I'm like, well, why not? He's like, because every time I do, they don't want to live there. It's like, oh, I was didn't get the right feel. Well, maybe they didn't even think about it that way. But that's that implicit bias. You know, in the justice system, it's pretty well documented that, you know, drug use between Blacks and whites is the same, but Blacks are much more likely to be arrested for it. They get longer sentences. They're less likely to be paroled. The death penalty is applied very disproportionately to African Americans. If you haven't seen the movie Just Mercy, I really recommend watching it. It's for free right now. And even within the family, like one of the big structural differences between a lot of Black families and white families, what they call the marriage gap. And that, you know, people that grow up without fathers, they have a harder time at school. They're more likely to get involved in crime. They have greater physical health problems and mental health problems. They're much more likely to be in poverty. And so we see that breakdown in the family. That's one of the negative things that came out of the sexual revolution. We see it disproportionately affecting the Black community. And so, you know, I gave a bunch of examples there, and you can see, I loved what Brian and Ogechi said, that it's not, you can't fit Jesus and you can't fit the gospel and you can't fit the solution into your ism, right? You can't fit it into being a conservative or a Democrat, because some of those things I listed are things that like the Democrats would be like, yes, I will vote for that. And other things the Republicans would be like, yes, that's the real problem. And you see that, well, really it's, you got to look at the person. You got to look at the dignity of the person in every circumstance. You got to look at the individual sin and the social sin and the structural sin. So yeah.
Those are, Dom, I know you had something, Dom. Thank you so much, Mike. Dom?
No, I just wanted to say that, you know, for me, it's been a little different just because of the way I look. People can never figure out what I am. And so I've had people say all sorts of things to me, but someone in the church actually, she was a nun, and she said to me, "Are you Latina?" And I said, "No." And she goes, "Come on." And she went through she named all these Latin countries, and I was like, "No." And I said to her, "My family is from Haiti." And her response to me was, "You can't be from Haiti because Haitians are ugly." And I took a step back and I processed what she said. And I said to her, "Where are you getting this from?" She goes, "I mean, don't you watch the news? Don't you see what?" And I thought to myself, you know what? This is the problem. this is the problem. Where is this woman getting her information? Where are a lot of people getting their information? You know, that she would assume. And then I had to explain to her that Haiti was the first independent country, Black country, and that it was colonized by the French, and that people are all different shades. And I explained it all to her, and she was surprised. But the point of that was that, you know, if I didn't have that conversation with her, she would have never known. And she already had a prejudice against me because I said I was Haitian, and she thinks Haitians are such and such. And so it was like you just said, Mike, we have forgotten that we all are all God's children, and we have an inherent dignity in us. And if we started treating each other like we had that dignity, we would view each other in a whole different way. Like you said, Brian, we can't fit Jesus into this preconceived idea of what we think it should be. We have to rise up to who Christ is and see that dignity in each and every person. So.
I wanted to say, you kept saying, thank you, Dom. You kept saying, where are people getting this information from? Well, one of my examples of when I saw things like that were just off, and the way, like, as an educator, as a teacher, I teach religion at the same school as Mike. Like, we were trying to find resources, you know, it was for like Black saints or even Latino saints, right? Or we're trying to find, and it was like I had to like dump things out. There was nothing book-wise, like in the books, that shared any kind of Black saints, like St. Charles Lwanga and St. Martin de Porres. Like, I knew them, but I couldn't find information. I couldn't find videos. I couldn't find access, like free videos, like on YouTube, right? There was overwhelming. I mean, you can find St. Maria Goretti. You can find, all these big players. You can find St. Francis of Assisi. Oh God, St. Francis of Assisi. You can find them, but I couldn't for the life of me find these. And it was so hard because my students would ask me and be like, why is American, like dead ass real, like, why is American Catholicism so white? And that was so hard because I know that the church is universal and worldwide, and the church is bigger in, like, you know, in places of Asia and Africa. We've had in modern Catholicism like an uptick in those places, you know, not as much anymore, like since we've reached the 2010s and 20s, but here we are. And, you know, when you say that, like, I don't know, I took it a different way. I'm like, man, like, I don't see that representation, or at least those resources that highlight and celebrate these folks, these brothers in Christ. It's almost being muted, or no one's taking the time to even make it or content create. So I guess I'm speaking to content creators like Ogechi and myself at the Holy Ruckus. Like, we're trying to like fill that void and talk about these things and have these conversations, because I guess in Catholic circles, we're not having them, or we're having them badly, you know? So here's my question for Brian. Because we talked about, we talked about on Tuesday, like how to become an ally, right? How to be a part of the solution and listen in and these steps of educating yourself, going on Google and typing in these, you know, these terms that, you know, were foreign to me, right? Especially so here it goes. My question was, before moving on to like responding to this structural racism, you know, considering all of this, like, how do we respond? Like, what does discipleship and allyship demand of us when it comes to structural racism? And you've hit on it, you know, but I want to just focus it a little bit more. Like, when it comes to like how to become an ally and how to become a disciple, like when it comes to like addressing this this disease of structural racism. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I may not be able to give you anything exhaustive, but I think for me, it's being understanding and empathetic. You know, I think it's problematic when someone comes into a situation with a can fix attitude. I'm just going to do this. These are the 5 steps that I'm going to do to solve everything. You may be giving answers to questions that people don't even have, or you may be solving problems that people aren't even dealing with. I think understanding and empathy, listening to a person's pain, like not listening just with your ears, but listening with your heart, that empathy, allowing their pain to infiltrate your heart and attaching it to your experiences so that you can better understand it. And from that heart perspective, speaking to that other individual. So like you have a heart-to-heart conversation. And when you have that heart-to-heart conversation, then pointing them to God. You know, I think the empathy is is going to be, is kind of
Key.
you know.
What did you
Understand-
think empathy was? Like,
What'd
what
you
is
say?
empathy? Like, I have an idea. What is empathy to you? Empathy.
When I think of empathy, I think of connecting my heart with the heart of another person, like understanding this person's experience from my own experiences. You know, it's difficult to go through what everyone has been through, but I know what pain feels like. I know what rejection feels like. I know what hurt feels like. So I was hurting this way, you were hurting this other way, but we still have that same feeling and that same longing. So I'm going to speak to that. I'm going to let my heart attach to your heart. I'm going to speak from my experience to your experience. I think that's what empathy is. So I think that's one thing, understanding where people are coming from. And I want to say another thing, you know, Ogechi and Father and Michael and Dominique, you all hit some phenomenal stuff. And like when we talked about not fitting Christ into our isms, and when you said about the inability to find saints that look of African descent so that you can teach your students, how powerful is, what type of message is that we can't even find saints that look like these people? You know, what does that do to a kid's psyche who wants to be Catholic but can't find someone that looks like themselves to kind of aspire to? You know, and Ogechi, historically, when you were given a vision of Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Christ looked like the people that were oppressing you. What does that do to the mentality of a person that, you know, how does that not mess you up and set you back in your pursuit of holiness? So, but I want to speak to like something that Father said. I think one of the difficulties, I think it's important to understand people's experiences. And if you want them to follow them, if you want them to follow you, you have to be honest with people. You have to respect their experiences and understanding that when you say something to people, they may not necessarily be processing it the same way you process it. If you want me to go down this path, okay, but don't sugarcoat the path or don't sugarcoat the person. Don't sugarcoat this stuff. Let me know that this path that I'm going down, it may be difficult for me in my culture and what I've experienced in the past. It may be difficult, but we're playing the long game. So what you're doing may cause some sacrifice, but allow me, just respect the intelligence of the people that you're ministering to and allow them to know, okay, what they're getting themselves into, because they may not understand it the same way that you understand it, but by telling them like, this is going to be difficult and respecting their intelligence, it will enable them to respect you and bring together community, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. It absolutely does, Brian. Thanks, man. Ogechi, I know you had something.
I agree. I think like we can all talk about I could write like 10 books about the microaggressions that I have experienced, whether it's outside of the church or even within the pews of the church. And to what Dom was saying, first of all, girl, you have the strength, the patience of Job, because maybe it was because it was like a nun or that you were not like immediately reactive. But I think the biggest thing for me to take away, and that I would hope that other people would take away, is that it goes beyond just, like we keep saying, it goes beyond just our personal responsibility, because like I said in the definition of structural racism, it's a combination of that interpersonal or personal responsibility, and then the policies that are written as a result. So that institutional racism, that creates that structural racism. And so a lot of people focus on their personal responsibility, and then we have to ask people, how are we attributing, how are we challenging that institutional racism and the combination and the ways that overlap that create this big structural system of racism. And so some of the ways that I personally act to challenge that, and maybe this can encourage other people outside of what we talked about with allyship and reading books and learning about Black saints. There's a whole Black Saints month. If you didn't know that, then now you know. So whenever that month happens, I can't remember the exact month right now, but look out for Black saints. Change your lens of thinking. So your personal level could be something that changes policies or practices institutionally. So if you see your church doesn't offer something that might be beneficial to a diverse group of people, ask for that to happen. Say, why isn't there examples in the curriculum about Black saints? Or when they give a list of potential confirmation saints and it's always the same 5 names, insert names of different kinds of saints that are Black, Asian, whatever, to create that norm that that should be something that's already part of the policies and procedures of religious education, whether it's in your workplace, whether it's with your friends, kind of always personally help change the institutional norm. And I think together with, if you choose to do activism, I am a community organizer, and the beauty of community organizing is that I have the moral responsibility to seek out inequities. And once you seek out inequities, you see that in every aspect of your life. You see that in the workplace, you see that with students. Why aren't, for example, if you have a college day at your school, are they inviting HBCU schools to that college day? Are they offering historically Black colleges to come to speak to your school? And the simple question of why not changes that mindset, and it shifts the lens for people that might have just been in their bubble, that tunnel, and they don't see it. And so that practice of changing your personal lens and then asking that why question and shifting other people's lenses helps change policies and procedures. And I think that can be done inside and outside of the church.
Let me say something real quick. Like, just one thing I think that's key to know is that this is not this whole situation is not an easy fix, you know. And, it took us a while to get to where we are right now, you know, and it's going to take us a while to get out of that, you know. And the worst thing is for people to start things and then just drop it, because that's been our tendency in the past. You know, something like this happens, what's happening right now, like the pain has happened before. And then we've had the discussion of, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to do these 5 things. And then football season starts up again. And then we lose our attention, and then we go, we have to understand this. It took us time to get here. It's going to take us time to get out of it, And if we're going to do something, we're playing the long game, because, the pain is deep. The pain is rooted in, and the reformation is going to take time. So it's good to start out, but just understand that if we're serious about it, this is going to take time to get us out of the situation that we're in right now,
Mm-hmm. Mike,
yes.
anything?
And can I just
add go ahead,
one thing? I think in all of this, when we talk about racism, it's always related to power. And so it's always a majority group that has the power to affect the lives of a minority group. And that power comes with a lot of responsibility. And so we all have power, and in community organizing, we talk about people power. And so there's like the responsibility for us to, those of you that may not be Black, you might think that like, I don't have this history of racism, or I've never done this or that, but you have the power just by nature of the privilege that you have. And so in my sense, you have an even greater responsibility to do the work together with all of the other different minority groups to really make sure that change is sustainable. I think, like Brian was saying, a lot of people get exhausted, and the people that are in the forefront are usually the people of color that are initiating the fight for justice, and they get exhausted. But that power of the majority can really make sure that the change sustains itself. And so I want people to remember that when we talk about structural racism, we're not talking about laws that can be written, because we've seen laws written. We're talking about power dynamics that need to be changed. And with that comes the willingness to share your power.
Ogechi, I'm sorry, but
Nah.
I just want to affirm this, because Ogechi, you hit it. It's sometimes people get like intimidated because they're not African American, and they're like, okay, what should I do? I can't do anything. If you have the heart to care, I think that's where it starts. If you have the heart to care and you're guided by that heart, that's the most important thing. We may not have the same experiences, but you can come to me and say, honestly, I heard for you, and I want to know, what I can do, to help you out. You know, and I think a lot of people get intimidated. They say, I can't do anything because I don't have that experience, or I shouldn't do anything because I can't share in their experience. Doesn't matter. If you have the heart to care about other people, I think that's where you start. Everything else you'll figure out.